Hello and welcome to South Asia Chat, a podcast series brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. I'm Devyani Chaturvedi, Research Analyst at ISAS, and I will be your host for today's episode. The G20 summit held under India's presidency in New Delhi on 9th and 10th September brought with it significant geopolitical changes. The summit launched the Delhi Declaration, which brought to the forefront international cooperation on finance, climate change, women led development, food security, digital public infrastructure, and multilateralism. Beyond these themes, India's proposal for inclusion of the African Union as a member of the G20 was also met with success. In fact, countries' activities moved beyond the G20 proceedings, and we witnessed the launch of the Global Biofuels Alliance, with United States, India, and Brazil as its founding members, that aims to reshape the global biofuels landscape, providing a platform for collaboration. There was also a surprise memorandum of understanding for India Middle East Europe corridor with India, France, Germany, Italy, United States, United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia as members. Therefore, all in all, the G20 presidency for India posed new opportunities for its foreign policy. To further deconstruct India's foreign policy at the end of its presidency, joining me today is Professor C Raja Mohan, visiting research professor at ISAS NUS. Welcome, Prof. Mohan.
Thank you. Thank you, Devyani. Thank you.
There have been two other instances in Indian history where India has hosted major conferences. The first was the Asian Relations Conference in 1947, followed by the Non-Aligned Movement Summit in 1983. On drawing comparisons to these two major conferences, what does India's G20 presidency have to say about India's evolution as a global power and its position in international politics?
That's a very good question. I think to compare what happened at G20 summit in Delhi to the 1947 Asian Relations Conference as well as the 1983 Non-Aligned Summit. The Asian Relations Conference was really reflected the emergence of post-colonial Asia and the expansive ambitions of the Indian political class that was just gaining independence, and the sense that they could build in Asia a big, massive post-colonial order. That the time has come to Asian post-colonial states to join hands and build this new world order based on not based no longer on Western domination of almost four centuries. But as it turned out, the conference was not such a great success. There were deep divisions within Asia. There was differences on the kind of economic strategy to pursue. There was a differences on who should be represented. There were also questions of territorial problems. For example, China was upset that the Tibet was shown as part of India's part as a separate territory. So I think all the future problems of Asia, of competing ideas about economic modernization, territorial disputes, and differing attitudes to Western capital, all these came to the fore. So there was another conference in 1955. By the time the enthusiasm to build a Asian order had actually had collapsed. And by then, after 1955, the Asian relations idea morphed into a global platform that bringing the Africans, bringing the others into this new coalition became the non-aligned movement. I mean, by 1961, when the first summit of the non-aligned ENAM took place in Yugoslavia at that time, which was united at the time, the idea that we must bring together all the developing countries, all the post-colonial states, not just limited to Asia, and that they needed to get their voice heard in a world that was increasingly being divided into the Cold War blocks. But yet, even at the non-aligned summit, it was not easy to forge unity among the few countries. I mean, barely 30-odd countries that attended at the time. For example, Jawaharlal Nehru thought that the contestation between Russia and the United States, the nuclear arms race, addressing the peace question, because recall at the time the hydrogen bombs were beginning to go off. So Nehru said peace is the more important issue, while radical leaders in the developing world, like Sukarno of Indonesia, others insisted, no, we need to confront imperialism, we need to confront colonialism. So the radicalization, attempt at radicalization. So Nehru had his way, but it's quite clear the strategies were beginning to diverge. And then brings us to the non-aligned summit in Delhi. By the time the non-aligned summit took place in Delhi in 1983, the divisions within the non-aligned movement were really deep. For example, Pakistan was deeply involved in the Afghan jihad against Soviet Union. The Southeast Asian countries were up in arms against Vietnam and Soviet-backed regime in Cambodia. In South Africa, most African countries were opposed to Cuban intervention backed by Soviet Union. So in a way, the regional conflicts in Asia produced new divisions. Second, I think the traditional argument the West should keep, the NAM should keep distance from the US, no longer had credibility because you had some countries were already opening up their economies, drawing closer to the US in Southeast Asia. So I think it was already quite clear NAM was incapable of addressing in a coherent manner the strategies facing the world. So there you were. So 1983, you could say, was the peak non-alignment, and the deep divisions within the system came to the fore. India's leadership, there's very little India could do. For example, on the Iran-Iraq war. So in the sense that while there was big talk, it was quite clear the non-aligned movement was going nowhere. So I think compared to those today, the G20 is a different kettle of fish. Unlike the earlier meetings, you had both the first world, that is, you can say the US and the leading Western economies for the so-called G7. The second world, if you will, Russia and China were represented here. China, for example, was not in the non-aligned summit. So I think this is actually a far more consequential grouping than the NAM, though the numbers were much larger. This is really what you come closest to a steering committee for the global economy. So in a sense, this is really serious stuff, not a trade union trying to challenge the existing order, but actually India is part of the 20 countries that were trying to reorganize to cope with the world's crisis. So this is a different fish, and I think this marks India's emergence as a major economy, and in India as the fifth largest economy, how it can contribute to the management of the global order. So there's a big shift from a protesting, opposing, trade union to one which actually a management attempted taking leadership role in the international system.
Thank you, Prof. Mohan. That really lays out the landscape and gives us a very in-depth understanding of India's evolution through these conferences, but also contextualizes it to where India's global positioning is at the moment. So, looking a bit inward, what do you think? What does India's G20 presidency tell us about the intersection between domestic politics and foreign policy?
It tells a lot. I think Prime Minister Narendra Modi is actually, I think, probably the first leader in a long time since the beginning of the reform era to see the value of foreign policy for domestic purposes. In some sense, since he took charge, he tried to take foreign policy events to the other cities outside Delhi, because the previous coalition governments, starting from 1989 to 2014, largely treated diplomatic events as a bureaucratic exercise that was limited to central Delhi. Visit Rajghat, have meetings in Hyderabad House, banquet at the end of the day. There was no involvement of the people. So I think what the Prime Minister saw the value of mobilizing Indian people into the conduct of Indian foreign policy. You recall he took Shinzo Abe to both Ahmedabad and to Varanasi. He met Xi Jinping for the first time in Ahmedabad. And in Goa, we had the BRICS summit. So I think the idea that take foreign policy to the people, and I think with G20, that became really huge exercise. So I think there is a massive generation of popular interest in foreign policy. And of course, it's not shocking that it also gives Prime Minister Modi's image a big boost at home. And I think the idea that India is leading the world is going to be a big plank, I think, in the BJP's election campaign in the coming next year.
Absolutely. Thank you, Prof. Mohan. So, prior to the G20 meeting, there were speculations on the impact of Chinese President Xi Jinping and Russian leader Vladimir Putin's absence from the G20 proceedings. How would you read the fact that this was the first G20 meeting that Xi has missed? Also, what impact did this have? Is Xi's absence a sign of China looking to focus on other multilateral forums where it has increasing influence, like an expanding BRICS or SCO? Did Xi's absence allow countries like US and India to develop and display their growing relations?
I would say we shouldn't read too much meaning into Xi's for the first time. He did not attend this meeting. After all, they had the prime minister at the meeting. So I think countries, it's not that every time, like President Biden has not gone to the East Asia summit. He sent Vice President Kamala Harris there. There were times when Indian Prime Minister could not attend, and the Foreign Minister or the Vice President often goes for these events. I don't think that is the main issue. The real issue is there is tension between US and China. There is tension between India and China. And how is that playing out? In some senses, what we saw at the G20 was really Biden reaching out to the BRICS countries. For example, he had a separate engagement with India, Brazil, South Africa, who are also members of the G20, along with the World Bank President Ajay Banga, to talk about development in the global South. So I think that is far more consequential. I think rather than the presence or absence of Xi Jinping at the summit, my sense is I don't think he was terribly missed. While everyone analyzes it, the show goes on, and the real change I think is India's activism and India and the US working together on global South issues along with other BRICS partners.
Absolutely. I think talking about India and US playing a critical role in working together, coinciding with the G20 proceedings was also the MOU signed between India, US, UAE, France, Germany, Italy, and Saudi Arabia, announcing the India Middle East Europe corridor, also known as IMEC, which would connect ports across the two continents through railway lines. Apart from direct commercial benefits, what will be some of the geostrategic opportunities posed by IMEC? Interestingly, the IMEC partnership has also proved that the US India partnership has moved beyond the Indo Pacific to the Middle East. How do you think this new dimension would impact their bilateral relations?
No, absolutely. I think this is a major geopolitical turn, I think, in India's engagement with the northwestern parts to the parts northwest of the subcontinent and with Europe. But I think we should not get too carried away. I mean, this has to be implemented. This is really an idea at this time, and the countries have promised that, including US, EU, France, Italy, Germany, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, and along with India, that they will meet in 2 months' time and outline a action plan. But this is something all of us, including at ISAS, I think will watch this very closely to see where this project is going. But in terms of looking at the longer term implications, what you have is really historically Pakistan blocked India's access. Since partition, Pakistan became a bloc. Pakistan wouldn't give us access to Central Asia and to through Afghanistan. Iran was willing to give access, but Iran and Russia, we had developed this idea of a north-south corridor. The problem is Iran and Russia are not great economic actors; they're locked in conflicts, so that didn't go very far. And meanwhile, China was getting its BRI into the region to link up the region. So I think this gives India an opportunity to work with like-minded nations to develop connectivity between India, Arabia, and Europe. The good thing here is that there's no shortage of resources. EU has a global gateway plan; they can bring in the resources. Secondly, both UAE and Saudi Arabia are flush with cash; they can put in money, and India. Is also now devoting a lot of attention to promoting connectivity. And here, I mean, it's actually fairly simple in the proposition that you're not building a whole road from Bombay to Greece or somewhere. It's really you build a railway line connecting Arabian Sea coast from one end to the other, and shipping connectivity already exists between India and the UAE. Expand it, modernize it, and there is connectivity in the Mediterranean between the Arabian Peninsula and Europe, so develop those connectivity. So I think it's not too hard to execute. So a railway line, once that gets built in the heart of Arabia, that itself will be enough to start this off. Even more interesting is the fact that this, along with this, new energy pipelines can be laid. There's talk about hydrogen being supplied across this line. There's talk about data, optic fibers. So I think it's really an ambitious plan, and I think it's a doable plan. And this puts India really in the heart of engagement with Europe and the United States. See, until 3 years ago, it was a common thing to say, "Oh, India will never work with the U.S. in the Middle East. India has nothing in common with the West in the Middle East." But today, it is partnering both U.S. and the European Union. So I think there's a big shift in the way we thought about the world, that India has as much to do with the West in the Middle East as it has in the Indo-Pacific.
Absolutely. Thank you, Prof. Mohan. I think that completely lays out what has changed in India's relations with the US and the Middle East, but also brings to light the significance of IMEC and what are the short, medium, and long term possibilities and opportunities that it provides. So, the African Union's membership to the G20 was one of the priorities for India's G20 presidency, under the latter's aim for inclusion. How do you think this push by India influenced its relations with the global south?
No, I think one of the major outcomes, I mean, if you recall, over the last 1 year, from the time that India took charge, it kept insisting that, look, we want to bring up the issues of the global south. You might recall that Prime Minister Modi hosted a virtual summit of the global south. Almost 125 nations attended. So I think the big idea in terms of, look, this just can't be about the developed economies or the top 20 economies. Under the pandemic and the Ukraine war have really created deep crises in the developing world, and that they need to be addressed. I think what is significant is that the fact that the US and the West were willing to support this agenda. Contrary to much of the public analysis, the idea that India and the US were at loggerheads in the global south, actually, what we've seen is thanks to the Ukraine war and the recognition in the West that many in the global south were not buying into the narrative of the United States on Ukraine. So they were willing now to think about this differently and to reconnect with the global South and its issues. So I think that provided a basis for of transforming the engagement with the global South, and then the African Union's membership was really a symbolic reflection of this major shift in the priorities of the G20.
So, when the G20 occurred and India took its presidency from Indonesia, the G20 occurred in a context in which established forms of multilateralism seemed to be in a crisis. How do you see the future of institutions like the G20, and how do you locate challenges of deglobalization within the evolving geopolitics?
Yeah, my sense is that Delhi was successful in salvaging the old forms of multilateralism. For example, the G20 was set up in 2008 to deal with the global financial crisis. But since then, the divisions between the major powers have deepened, both on the geopolitical side as well as on the economic side, because the WTO too is in a crisis. The UN Security Council is paralyzed. So therefore, you have a crisis in multilateralism. And I think what Delhi managed was in getting a consensus document to limit those breakdown of the multilateral system. But that doesn't mean the crisis is over. To the extent that India has sought to emerge as a bridge is good. But I think my sense is we're going to see further divisions between Sino-Russian axis and the West over Ukraine, as well as deepening tensions over trade-related issues in the coming years. So I think India has a huge burden looking ahead, that can it build on the achievement of the G20 to become a bridge between global South and the global North, as well as preventing a breakdown of the relationship between East and West in the coming decades. So this is a good experience, and I think it's really India now. The challenge is to build on this to be a factor contributing to global stability and order.
Thank you so much, Prof. Mohan, for reflecting on India's role as a bridging power and its relations post G20 and during its G20 presidency vis a vis the United States, the Middle East, its immediate neighborhood to a certain degree, and its relations with the global south. Thank you for joining us. You were listening to South Asia Chat. To learn more about our work, please visit us at isas.nus.edu.sg. You can also get updates from our social media platforms. We are on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter.